There is a ring of stones sitting in the Egyptian desert that is older than the pyramids, older than the Sphinx, older than the pharaohs, older than the very idea of Egypt. It was built by people who studied the sky with such precision that they carved the movement of the sun into slabs of stone, and then arranged those slabs so a beam of light would pass through a gate on one single morning of the year. Most people have never heard of it. The ones who visit walk right past the low broken stones without a second look. But those stones are a machine, a working astronomical instrument built to track the heavens, and it is the oldest one ever found on this planet. And the people who built it are gone. They did not leave temples with their names on them. They did not leave writing. They left a stone calendar in the middle of one of the driest places on Earth, a calendar that still points exactly where they aimed it thousands of years ago. Then they vanished. And here is the part that keeps this from being just another pile of old rocks. The knowledge they carved into the desert does not disappear when they do. It shows up again centuries later, hundreds of miles away, in the beliefs and the rituals and the sky watching of the civilization we call ancient Egypt. As if the pharaohs did not invent themselves at all. As if they inherited it from someone who came before. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A physical site, mapped, excavated, and dated, and it rewrites the order in which things are supposed to have happened. The stones are only the beginning, because when the excavators started digging beneath them, they found something shaped by human hands, buried deep in the sand, that weighs 3 tons and should not have been possible for the people who left it. And beneath the whole complex, there is a story of a green land that turned to dust, a population that walked east into legend, and a set of ideas that never died. 3 clues are buried in this desert. The first, one you can see with your own eyes. The last one is the one that changes everything. So, let's start where the light comes through. The place is called Nabta Playa. It sits in the Nubian desert in the far south of Egypt, roughly 100 kilometers west of the temples at Abu Simbel, about 800 kilometers south of Cairo, and around 60 miles from the nearest bank of the Nile. Today, it is one of the most hostile stretches of ground on the planet. Bare sand, brutal heat, no water, nothing. There is no reason for anyone to be out there. And that is exactly why nobody looked for thousands of years. The story of how it was found is almost an accident. In 1973, a team of archaeologists was driving across this empty desert. According to one version, told by the Polish archaeologist Romuald Schild, the whole thing came down to a bathroom break. The vehicles stopped, the team got out, and there on the surface of the sand were the tops of stones that had no business being there. The American archaeologist leading the group, Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University, at first thought they were just natural rock, but then he understood something about the ground he was standing on. This was an ancient lake bed, and a lake bed like this would have torn any natural rock formation apart. These stones had been placed here, on purpose, by someone. Wendorf would come back to that spot for the rest of his life. What he and his team slowly uncovered over the following decades turned Nabta Playa from a curiosity into one of the most important prehistoric sites in the world. Because that was not a wet region by accident either. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. A shift in the monsoon rains had pulled seasonal water far north, and this basin filled every year into a lake. Grass grew, herds could graze, and people came, following the water and their cattle across a green Sahara that no longer exists. They were not primitive drifters. This is the detail that gets buried under the word Neolithic, so listen to it carefully. They dug wells, and not shallow scrapes in the mud. They dug down until they hit water that would hold through the dry season. Engineered wells that let them survive in a place that emptied out for months at a time. They laid out their settlements in planned arrangements, in straight lines, in deliberate patterns, with a level of organization that archaeologists found startling for people supposedly this early in the human story. Some researchers have said the people of Nabta Playa lived more organized lives than their own contemporaries living along the Nile itself. Read that again. The desert people were more organized than the river people. That is not how the story is supposed to go. And at the center of their world, on the north shore of that vanished lake, they built in stone. Here is the first clue. The one you can see instantly, the one that hits you before anyone explains a single thing. It is a circle of stones, small by the standards of Stonehenge, only about 4 meters across. But set into that circle are pairs of upright slabs arranged to form gateways. Two of those gateways line up along a north to south axis. And here is where it stops being decoration. On the morning of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly in line with one of those gates. The stones frame it. The light comes through. For the people who lived here, that sunrise was not a ceremony. It was survival. The summer solstice in this region marked the return of the monsoon rains. The moment the lake would begin to fill again, the moment the grass would come back and the cattle would live, these people needed to know in advance when the water was coming. So they built a device to tell them. A stone that catches one specific sunrise out of 365. That is not art. That is a calendar. That is a clock built out of rock and sky, and it is the oldest one humanity has ever discovered. And there is a second direction built into that circle, running north to south, and it is just as practical as the solstice line. Out here, in a flat and featureless desert that could kill you in a day, knowing which way is north was not academic. It was the difference between reaching the next lake and dying of thirst between them. These were nomads who moved from seasonal water to seasonal water across ground with no landmarks. To do that, they navigated by the stars, the same way desert travelers in this region still do. A fixed north line, carved permanently into stone at a gathering place everyone returned to, is exactly what a culture of star navigators would build. So, the two axes of that little circle carry the two things that kept these people alive. North, to cross the desert, and the summer sunrise, to know when the water was coming back. Nothing about it is decoration. Every stone is a tool. For a long time, that seemed like the whole story. A clever solstice marker, a navigation aid. Impressive for its age, but simple. Then someone looked closer at the other stones, and the simple explanation started to fall apart. Because the circle has more than just those solstice gates. Inside it sit a handful of stones that do not line up with the sun at all. They do not point at any of the cardinal directions. They seem, at first, random. And around the outside, other slabs and lines of megaliths run off across the sand in directions that made no sense to anyone measuring against the horizon. If this was only a solstice calendar, half of it should not exist. So, the question became simple and unavoidable. If these stones are not pointing at the sun, what are they pointing at? That is the second clue. And this is where a lake bed in the desert turned into something that looks like a star chart carved in stone. An astrophysicist named Thomas Brophy took the layout of those inner stones and did something no one had done. He traced them not against the ground, but against the ancient sky. Not the sky we see now, but the sky as it stood thousands of years ago. Because the stars themselves drift over the millennia in a slow wheel called precession. And when he wound the heavens back to the age of Nabta Playa, the pattern appeared. 3 of the stones inside the circle lined up with 3 of the most recognizable stars in the sky. The 3 stars of Orion's belt. Other stones seemed to track the risings of some of the brightest stars visible in that era. Sirius, Arcturus, Alpha Centauri. And it was not only the small circle. Away from it, across the old lake bed, the excavators found lines of much larger megaliths, big standing stones, dragged into position and set in long alignments across the sand. When the astronomer Malville sat among them and started mapping, he described it as an epiphany. He realized the buried stones were not scattered at all. They radiated outward from a central burial mound, like spokes from the hub of a wheel. Every megalith they dug out of the sediment fell onto a line. Someone had planned this across the whole landscape, not just inside one 4-meter ring. Several of those long southern lines of megaliths, the analysts argued, pointed at the very same stars encoded in the little circle, all lining up to the same distant epoch. Whether or not every one of those alignments holds up, the intent behind the layout is hard to wave away. This was a designed landscape. There is one more piece that makes the star reading harder to dismiss. When researchers compared the geometry of Nabta Playa to other African sites, they found an echo. A separate megalithic calendar site, Namaratunga, discovered far to the south in northern Kenya, appears to encode a related star-based calendar system. Two ancient African cultures, separated by enormous distance, both building stone instruments to read the same sky. This was not a one-off freak of the desert. It looks like a way of thinking that ran deep and wide across ancient Africa, long before the first pharaoh drew breath. Think about what that means. These were not just people watching for one sunrise. They were tracking specific stars, learning their cycles, and building a map of the night sky into the ground, across an entire landscape, thousands of years before Egypt would build a single temple aligned to the stars. And if you know anything about the pharaohs, that particular pattern should stop you cold. Orion. Because the Egyptians, thousands of years later, would tie the constellation of Orion to their god of the dead and the afterlife, and would famously build in ways that echoed those same stars. The obsession with Orion did not begin with the pyramids. It may have begun out here, in the sand, with people who had no cities and no writing at all. And if you find this kind of buried history as unsettling as I do, take 1 second and subscribe, because this channel exists to dig up exactly these forgotten chapters, the ones that were sitting in plain sight the whole time. Now, before we go further, I have to be honest about the fight over those stars, because it matters. When Wendorf and his colleague, the astronomer J. McKim Malville, published their analysis of Nabta Playa in the journal Nature in 1998, it made headlines around the world as a Stonehenge in the Sahara. But the specific star alignments Brophy proposed and the very early dates he attached to them were challenged hard. In 2007, a team that included several of the original discoverers pushed back, arguing that some of Brophy's dates were roughly 1,500 years too early, and that shifting sand and thousands of years of damage make any exact stellar alignment difficult to prove. Even the most dramatic idea, that the arms of the site encoded the distances to those stars, and that a slab buried beneath the stones was a map of our galaxy, has been set aside as going too far. But here is the thing the skeptics and the believers actually agree on. Even at its most conservative, this site is a deliberate astronomical monument, older than any other on Earth, built by people who were watching the sky with intent. You do not need the wildest version to be shaken by it. The careful version is already extraordinary, and that is when the excavators started digging underneath and found the third clue, the one nobody expected. Because Nabta Playa is not only a circle, scattered across the site are structures the archaeologists called complex structures, low mounds built directly on top of natural bedrock slabs they named table rocks. From the surface, they look like nothing. Piles of stone, half swallowed by sand, but under one of them, buried deliberately beneath the earth, the team found a single enormous stone that had been carefully shaped by hand. Some who saw it described it as sculpted into the rough form of a cow. It had been dragged into place, worked, and then hidden underground, on purpose, by people using nothing but muscle and simple tools. And this was not a light stone. In one of these complex structures, the shaped stone resting above the table rock weighed in the region of 3 tons. We know that number precisely because when a modern excavation team wanted to lift it back out of the ground, they needed a 3-ton pulley, a wire cable, ropes, and 12 people hauling together just to move it. That is the effort it took us with steel and engineering. The people who buried it there did it with none of that. They quarried it, they shaped it, they transported it, and they set it beneath the earth. And they did it because it mattered enough to be worth that staggering amount of work. So why a cow? Why bury a stone shaped like cattle out here with this much care? Because cattle were everything to these people. This was a herding culture and a place where an animal that needs water every day or two was a walking measure of your survival. And the cattle were not just food. They were wealth, they were status, and, it turns out, they were sacred. When Wendorf's team excavated the central mound of the site, the great tomb at the heart of it, they were digging with a specific hope. A monumental burial like this, in a ceremonial center like this, surely covered an important person. A chief, a priest. They dug, expecting human bones. Instead, they found a cow. A whole young cow, laid in an oval chamber dug into the earth, lined with clay, and roofed with stone. Not thrown into a pit, entombed. And it was not the only one. Across the northern part of the site sat a cluster of mounds, and beneath them, again and again, the burials of cattle, carefully placed, deliberately covered, treated in death the way you would treat royalty. Stop and picture the labor. Digging a lined chamber by hand in that ground, roofing it with stone, raising a mound over it, and doing it for an animal, over and over, across generations. You do not spend that kind of effort on something you merely eat. They were sacrificing and burying their cattle with reverence in dedicated tombs thousands of years before anyone in this region could write a word. That is not livestock. That is a god. And now hold that image next to ancient Egypt, because when Egyptian civilization finally rises along the Nile, one of the most powerful deities in its entire religion is Hathor, a goddess pictured as a cow tied to fertility, to the desert and to the sky, and worshipped in her older forms as a protector out in the desert regions. The Egyptians would go on to keep sacred bulls, most famously the Apis bull, and bury them in vast dedicated tombs, treating specific living cattle as gods walking on earth. That exact instinct, the animal as divine, the cow as a bridge between the living and the sacred, appears fully formed and buried in the sand out at Nabta Playa, centuries before Egypt exists. Wendorf himself said that if these desert herders helped found the civilization of the Nile, it would explain the religious weight the Egyptians placed on cattle in the Old Kingdom. And remember the stars. Remember Orion sitting inside that circle. Because the Egyptians would tie the constellation of Orion to Osiris, their lord of death and rebirth, and orient some of their most sacred architecture toward it. The two deepest obsessions of pharaonic religion, the sacred cow and the stars of Orion, are both sitting in the sand at Nabta Playa, thousands of years early, in a place that had no cities, no metal, and no writing. For decades, that was treated as a nice coincidence. But it is not just the cows. It is the star watching. It is the north-south planning. It is the monumental stone building, the reverence for the sky, the ceremonial center that people traveled to and returned to. It is a whole package of ideas that has no clear ancestor in the early Nile Valley and then appears there all at once. So the real question is not whether Nabta Playa is old. It is whether Nabta Playa is where Egypt actually came from. And to answer that, you have to explain what happened to the people who built it. Because they did not stay, here is where it gets strange. The Green Sahara was living on borrowed time. The same rains that filled the lake and made this whole world possible were slowly retreating south. And around 5,500 years ago, the researchers who studied this site identified the moment the water finally failed. Hyperaridity. The lake did not just shrink, it died. The grass died, the wells could no longer save them. The entire reason to live out here evaporated, one dry season at a time, until the desert we see today closed over everything. And the people who had spent thousands of years reading the sky, burying their cattle, and raising stone in this basin faced a simple, brutal choice: move or die. They moved, and there was really only one place to go: east, toward the one water that never failed, the Nile. This is the reveal that ties the whole site together. And this is not fringe speculation. The team that first published Nabta Playa in Nature in 1998 pinned the onset of that killing dryness to around 5,500 years before the present, and openly speculated about what it meant for the Nile when waves of desert people were suddenly pushed toward the river. Mainstream archaeologists, tracing the origins of the Badarian culture, one of the earliest farming cultures of Upper Egypt and a direct ancestor of dynastic civilization, have concluded that its roots were probably shaped most heavily by events in the Western Desert. In plain language, when scholars ask where pre-dynastic Egypt actually came from, one of the strongest answers points back out into the sand, toward places like Nabta Playa. The strong influence of Saharan cattle herders on the development of early Egyptian culture shows up in the iconography, in the ritual objects, in the religion. The roots of Egyptian belief, as Wendorf and Schild put it in their own words, lie at least partly buried in the sands of that southwestern desert. The civilization that vanished did not truly vanish. It walked into the Nile Valley carrying its calendar, its stars, its sacred cattle, and its knowledge of how to plan a settlement and raise a monument in stone. Its ideas were still standing when the ground it built on had become the emptiest place on earth. And a few thousand years later, that inheritance rose up along the river in the shape of temples, tombs, and pyramids. And none of this rests on guesswork about the age. The site is anchored in hard dates. Radiocarbon readings taken from the remains of ancient campfires and hearths scattered across the old lakebed place, human activity here across thousands of years, with the megalithic building phase falling in the later stretch of that occupation. The calendar circle itself is generally dated to around 4,800 years before the Common Era, which is roughly 2,000 years before the first stone of Stonehenge was raised. When you line up the numbers, the sequence is unavoidable. The sky watching, the sacred cattle, the monumental stone, all of it is happening in the desert first, and only afterward blossoming along the Nile. That is the technology left behind by a civilization that vanished. Not machines, not lasers. Something more durable than any of that. A calendar, a star map, an engineering tradition capable of moving stones by the ton, and a religion. Encoded into the ground by people with no writing, and passed forward across the collapse of their entire world into the greatest civilization of the ancient age. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? No. It does not prove some lost super race. It does not prove a single unbroken line where every Egyptian idea marches straight out of Nabta Playa. History is messier than that. The Nile Valley had its own peoples, its own developments, and Egypt was built by many hands from many directions. The star alignments are still debated. The exact dates are still argued. Some of the boldest claims about this site have been walked back by serious scientists, and they were right to walk them back. But strip all of that away and look at what is left standing after the skeptics are done. A group of Neolithic herders in a place that is now one of the driest deserts on Earth dug wells that lasted the year, planned their settlements, tracked the solstice with a stone gate, watched specific stars across the sky, quarried and shaped and buried stones weighing 3 tons, worshipped their cattle in roofed tombs, and built the oldest astronomical monument humanity has ever found, 2,000 years before Stonehenge, and then carried all of it east when their world dried out. Even the careful, cautious, peer-reviewed version of Nabta Playa is a story that reorders the history of civilization. You do not have to exaggerate it. You just have to look at it, and it means our history is missing a chapter. We tell the story of civilization as if it switched on along a handful of great rivers, in Mesopotamia and along the Nile, as if the deserts around them were always empty and always silent, just backdrop. Nabta Playa says the opposite. It says the empty places were not always empty, that some of them held people who were thinking hard about the sky and the seasons, and the dead, while the famous river valleys were still finding their feet. It says the sky watchers and the stone builders and the priests were already out there in the sand, in a land that no longer exists, and that when the water failed, they did not die out. They moved, and they seeded something enormous. It means the pyramids may have a grandfather, and the grandfather is a broken ring of stones in the middle of nowhere that almost no one bothers to visit. The stones themselves have now been moved. To protect them from damage and looting, the main megaliths of the circle were lifted out of the desert and relocated to a museum in Aswan. What sits at the original site today is a reconstruction, and the true ground of it lies far out in the sand, hard to reach, rarely studied, largely forgotten by the millions of people who fly to Egypt every year to stare at the pyramids and never learn that something older was watching the same stars first. That is where it waits. A vanished lake, a vanished people, and a calendar of stone that still points at a sunrise no one is there to see. The knowledge did not die. It just went quiet, buried under the same desert that killed the world that made it. And somewhere in the story of how a green Sahara became the emptiest place on Earth, there is an entire lost civilization we have only just begun to understand. If this pulled you in, the next investigation is already waiting on screen. Go watch it now, because the story of what came before Egypt is far from over.